Hold on to your hats, folks, because even after postponing additional reciprocal tariffs from 11% to 49% on various countries excluding China for 90 days, until July 9, 2025, the Trump trade war is intensifying amid tariffs war between the two largest economies in the world, contributing almost half of the global GDP. President Trump, in a move bolder than a bald eagle riding a roller coaster, has slapped tariffs on almost everything coming into America. Yes, you heard that right, everything. From Japanese electronics to European cheese, it's all getting hit with a 10% import tax. But wait, there's more. He's also imposed even higher 25% sectoral tariffs on imported automobiles and metals, and as high as 145% on China, which hasn't been playing nice in the trade sandbox. The US now imports almost $3 trillion worth of merchandise goods annually, almost 45% of its requirements, and out of that, China contributes around 15% directly. Even at 10% basic universal tariff, and 145% Chinese, and 25% various sectoral tariffs, the weighted average US tariff would be around 27% versus 2.5% prior. This is a full-blown trade war, and the whole world is watching with bated breath. Contrary to Trump's narrative, these Trump tariffs will be paid by US importers and eventually borne by American consumers. This will eventually cause a high cost of living for Americans, higher inflation, higher unemployment, and lower economic growth, causing an all-out stagflation. If not recession, markets are in a frenzy, businesses are freaking out, and economists are warning of dire consequences. So buckle up, Buttercup, because things are about to get bumpy. We're diving headfirst into the chaotic world of Trump's tariffs to see what sparked this trade war, who's getting burned, and whether we're all headed for an economic meltdown. Now, before we grab our pitchforks and torches and march on Washington, or Beijing for that matter, let's take a trip down memory lane. Tariffs, my friends, are nothing new. They've been around since the dawn of trade, used by countries to protect their own industries and stick it to their rivals. Remember the Boston Tea Party? Yep, that was all about tariffs. And let's not forget the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, a disastrous piece of legislation that plunged the world deeper into the Great Depression and subsequently followed by World War II a decade later. The 1930s trade war, driven by protectionism like Smoot-Hawley, worsened the Great Depression and destabilized nations, indirectly paving the way for World War II. Tariffs, as history has shown us time and time again, can be a very dangerous game. But Trump, like a bull in a china shop, seems determined to rewrite the history books. He believes that by playing hardball with tariffs, he can force other countries to give America a better deal. But is he right? Or is he about to send the global economy crashing down around us? Let's break down Trump's tariff tango, Part 2.0. This is in addition to the prior 25% tariffs on Chinese goods since 2018, mostly under Trump 1.0 and partly under the Biden administration. Thus, cumulative Trump tariffs on Chinese consumer and industrial goods are now almost 150% since 2018, the start of Trump's trade war policy. China also imposed retaliatory reciprocal tariffs of almost 150% on US goods. That's right, folks, a blanket tariff, no discrimination. But wait, it gets juicier. Trump also punished China for its effort to form an anti-tariff group alliance with Japan, South Korea, India, the EU, and various other countries, including Canada. Trump rewarded almost all other countries except China for begging for relief, not opting for any retaliation, and also not trying to form any alliance against the United States of America, the #1 superpower in the world. Trump admin will now try to negotiate within this short period of 90 days about not only tariff barriers, but also other non-tariff and non-monetary barriers like significant local direct-indirect sales taxes, VAT, GSTs, etc., targeted regulations, state industrial agri-subsidy policies, and even alleged currency manipulation, effectively making exports to the US cheaper and exports from the US costlier. In short, Trump not only wants a universal minimum global tariff of 10%, or country-specific minimum tariff of around 10% to be applied to each other, but also lower or nil local sales taxes and free and fair access to export markets for US goods without any targeted regulations against the US. Trump wants to change the internal system of other countries so that US goods can compete globally, including in China. In his first term, Trump also wanted to change China and its SOE policies, and launched a tech and Cold War in addition to a trade war. At one point in time, Trump even threatened to terminate all types of relations with China. But China didn't succumb, despite intense pressure and bullying tactics. China fought Trump, engaging in marathon negotiations for two years, and then signed Trade Deal 1.0 in early 2020, just before COVID. Remember those existing tariffs from 2018? We'll add another 125% on top of those, bringing the total to a jaw-dropping 150%. It's enough to make your wallet cry. Trump's rationale: he wants a minimum 10% tariff globally. He's also demanding that other countries stop those pesky sales taxes on American goods, open up their markets to US exports, and stop manipulating their currencies. Oh, and he wants them to stop subsidizing their own industries because, that's unfair to American businesses. Basically, he wants to turn the global trade game on its head and make everyone play by his rules. Is it possible globally? Now let's talk about the elephant in the room: the economic consequences of this tariff free-for-all. Economists are warning that these tariffs could have a devastating direct impact on the US and indirectly on global economies. First up, inflation. America is not a manufacturing power hub. It has to import almost half of its domestic requirements. Cheaper imported goods help to maintain an overall lower cost of living, and the Goldilocks nature of the US economy. Those Trump tariffs on imported goods, they're going to translate into higher prices for everything from cars and clothes to groceries and gasoline. Get ready to say goodbye to those cheap Chinese imports, folks, because they're about to get a whole lot more expensive. And as prices rise, so too will the cost of living, squeezing household budgets and leaving consumers with less money to spend. If Trump's tariffs are implemented at face value, American families will face rising costs of living, with estimates suggesting an average $1,300. $4,000 increase per year for a person to a small family. This would be very difficult for a typical middle-class American family, most of which live paycheck to paycheck. This could lead to a slowdown in discretionary consumer spending, which, as we all know, is the growth engine of the US economy. But wait, there's more. Tariffs could also lead to tepid private business investment and expansion, resulting in job losses. As American companies face higher costs for imported materials and components, they may be forced to cut back on production, lay off workers, or even move their operations overseas. And if that's not enough to keep you up at night, there's also the looming threat of a recession. Many Wall Street and Main Street economists estimate that there's a FBIG chance of the US economy slipping into recession within the next year. So, how has the rest of the world reacted to Trump's tariff tantrum? Well, let's just say they're not exactly thrilled. China, never one to back down from a fight, has retaliated with tariffs of its own on American goods. We're talking tariffs as high as 84% on everything from soybeans and pork to cars and chemicals. They've also added 10 US companies to their unreliable entity list, which could make it difficult for those companies to do business in China. The European Union, Canada, Mexico, and other countries have also vowed to retaliate with tariffs of their own if Trump doesn't back down. It's a classic case of an eye for an eye, but in this case, everyone's going to end up blind. And the markets? Well, they've been on a roller coaster ride, swinging wildly between gains and losses as investors try to make sense of the chaos. The initial announcement of the tariffs sent shockwaves through global markets. But then Trump offered a temporary reprieve, pausing the tariffs for 90 days while negotiations continue. This led to a surge in stock prices, but the uncertainty remains, and the markets are still on edge. So what happens next? Trump is trying to reduce the huge US merchandise trade deficit by imposing draconian tariffs on other countries and forcing manufacturers into the US. But to become a major global local manufacturing hub and to compete with China, Trump needs China-like manufacturing and logistical infrastructure, which the US does not have at present, and it will take substantial time, effort, and also investment to do that. Almost all of Trump's $5 trillion private capex is in the initial MOU stage. Private businesses are also worried about Trump policy uncertainty and thus becoming cautious in fresh capex and hiring. The Trump administration is now divided over Trump's tariff policies. Trump is now trying to isolate China on tariffs and trade issues, but in the process, Trump may be isolating the US itself on globalization and trade. Various countries not so friendly with China, like Japan, South Korea, and even India, are now joining hands with China for trade, development, and prosperity, rather than never-ending US hegemony and policy uncertainty. Trump has to compete with China by creating a comparable manufacturing and logistical ecosystem, not by simply imposing tariff after tariff. The US importers may have already stocked or ordered goods from China and other affected countries well in advance to beat Trump's tariff uncertainty. But now, even at a 10% universal basic tariff, the US may give the highest tariff among developed nations. This 10% basic tariff is also meaningfully higher than the earlier 2.5%, and if we consider various sectoral tariffs like 25% on metals and automobiles and 145% on Chinese goods, almost 15% of US imports, the overall tariff may be around 27%, which is substantially higher than 2.5%. Thus, the concern of Trump's session remains, and Wall Street may again come under stress. Trump is known for his hardline stance on trade, and he's not likely to back down easily. And China, with its own economic might and national pride at stake, isn't going to cave in to Trump's demands easily without a fight. Now the US, China, and even many other countries are preparing for both monetary and fiscal stimulus to fight an all-out trade war, which may cause another wave of global inflation down the line, and even a synchronized global recession or financial crisis, like in 2007 to 2008. The stakes are incredibly high. If negotiations fail and the trade war escalates, the consequences could be dire for everyone involved. We're talking about a global recession, a collapse in international trade, and potentially even political instability. The world is at a crossroads. The outcome of these trade negotiations will have far-reaching consequences, shaping the future of the global economy and the balance of power for years to come. Will Trump's tariff tango force other countries to bend to his will, or will it backfire, pushing the world into a trade war that no one can win? One thing's for sure, the next 90 days are going to be a wild ride. Although Trump's logic about higher tariffs and targeted regulation on certain other countries is right, it's not applicable to China, especially after the 2020 Phase 1 China trade deal. The US political and policy uncertainty is now a big headache for the rest of the world, and also US investors. Trump could have introduced a federal sales tax on goods and services like GST or VAT like in India, China, Japan, or Europe, along with minimum basic universal tariffs of 5% globally, coupled with no targeted non-tariff barriers by all countries. But this may not be the case, and it's almost impossible to negotiate with 100+ odd countries worldwide for a definitive bilateral trade deal within this short period of 90 days. Thus, eventually, Trump may scale back his reciprocal tariffs completely, and may even impose only a 5% universal basic tariff for the sake of the US economy. At the same time, Trump may provide fresh income tax cuts worth around $1.5 trillion for American workers and businesses to undo the tariff damage on the US economy. Trump will also use reciprocal tariff threats on various high-tax countries like India to reduce its exorbitantly high tariffs and very stringent regulations against free and fair trade. High-tariff countries like India or even the US can't encourage inefficiencies by promoting higher tariffs and non-tariffs barrier. Higher tariffs and local sales taxes cause a higher cost of living and distort price stability. And without price stability, no economy can function properly, as we have seen in the case of tariff and GST King India. Trump needs higher revenue to fund his deficit spending like tax cuts and other planned infrastructure stimulus. Thus, he is eager to impose higher tariffs on Americans in the name of China and other exporters. Exporters will stop accepting orders from US importers rather than paying such Trump tariffs at gunpoint. China may even scrap the Phase 1 trade deal with the US and stop sending goods to the US. Although the US and China are both dependent on each other for prosperity and development, both the US and China have coexisted for decades after decades in a win-win situation. Despite significant expansion and diversification in global trade, the US is China's #1 client at around $500 billion annually. For the US, China is also the largest market after the EU, and many US MNCs are quite dependent on Chinese revenue. The US may not find an alternative global or local supply chain in lieu of China, and likewise, China may also face difficulties in finding a single client alternative for America. However, China has an advantage due to its strategic expansion of trade globally for the last 2 decades, rather than being too dependent on any single country or trade bloc like the US and EU. Thus, we may soon see signs of reconciliations rather than protracted confrontations. Back-channel talks may have already started between the US and China, which may take a definitive step towards a Phase 2 trade deal. China will negotiate from the position of strength and mutual respect, not US bullying. Trump's core advisory team is divided between China and tariff hawks and doves. Trump is also under pressure from his corporate donors and active advisors like Musk, various prominent Republican leaders, and also the Wall Street along with Main Street. Trump already blinked and postponed reciprocal tariffs rhetoric after Japan attempted some U.S. Treasury selling on April 9, 2025, but failed due to lack of buyer on the other side, resulting in almost dysfunctional U.S. Treasury market and resultant Wall Street capitulation. Thus, Trump is now showing more compulsion for immediate trade deal talks with China and others, and may even dial back his unconventional trade and tariff policy, partly or completely. Trump often blames the U.S. merchandise trade deficit on China and other exporter nations, including some U.S. allies. Trump also blamed China, Mexico, and even Canada for illegal drug and human trafficking into the U.S. But before blaming someone, Trump should have repaired his own house first and introspect why China is outpacing the U.S. in trade, education, innovation, healthcare, infra development, techs, and even military jets. The U.S. has to reset now to compete with China, rather than burning down in jealousy.